Welcome to episode 331 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to Dr. Kirk Yeager, the FBI's current chief explosive scientist. Kirk reviews his experiences working as a physical scientist and forensic examiner for the FBI Laboratory's Explosive Unit, where he has analyzed many of the world's biggest explosive crime scenes. Kirk is the FBI's top bomb expert. He and his team are tasked with analyzing explosives made by terrorists and developing advanced techniques to detect and prevent the next bombing. Kirk has nearly 30 years of experience with improvised explosives and improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and has deployed as a bombing crime scene investigator to dozens of countries around the world. Kirk has worked many of the most notable terrorism bomb attacks in recent history. Bali in October 2002, Beirut in June 2005, and the Boston Marathon bombing in April 2013. Over the course of his career, he has served as a subject matter expert for the National Academies of Sciences, worked as a technical advisor for the TV show Mythbusters, and has been the subject of a feature article in Popular Mechanics. Kurt has co-authored with his sister Celine Yeager, The Bomb Doctor, a scientist's story of bombers, beakers, and bloodhounds. In his book, he takes readers behind the caution tape at crime scenes and behind the do not enter signs on the laboratory doors, giving them a front row view of the scientific forensics it takes to solve cases and bring bombers to justice. During the case review, Kirk mentioned several bomb crime scenes that I've covered in other FBI Retired Case File episodes. I've tried my best to provide the episode numbers, but you can also use the search bar at the bottom of my website to find those episodes. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to join my reader team, where I talk about crime fiction, and you can learn about the FBI and books, TV, and movies. There's also a link where you can buy me a cup of coffee and discover my nonfiction book, FBI, Myths and Misconceptions, and my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All of my books are available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, the FBI's Chief Explosive Scientist, Dr. Kirk Yeager. Hey, Kurt, how are you?
I am wonderful, Jerry. I am glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're here too. I just finished reading your book this weekend. It's called The Bomb Doctor, a scientist's story of bombers, beakers, and bloodhounds. What a title. That's great.
It captures a whole variety of things that I anticipated and some I didn't anticipate when I took this job.
Well, the great thing about the book is that I liked your voice. It was not what I was expecting, more of a very educational lecture, from a scientist. It was really down to earth. And yeah, I could see you hanging out with, other FBI bomb examiners and agents in different places and, really fitting in. So I really enjoyed the voice of the book. And then the other thing I enjoyed about it was there were so many cases that you were involved in the forensic scientist role that I have already reviewed on the podcast for the investigative look at the case. And that includes the bombing in Casablanca that I interviewed Lauren Anderson for episode 156, the collar bomb pizza bomber investigation, the DC sniper investigation, the Boston Marathon. I'm sure that we'll talk about a few more that I've already covered on this podcast. But the two that are related most to what we're going to talk about today are the interviews that I did with Master Bomb Techs Kevin Miles, episode 86, and Barry Black, episode 308. And I understand that you know them both and are good friends with them.
Yeah, as Barry mentioned in his show, it is a small community. And Barry and Kevin really rose up through the ranks to become leaders in the community. And I was very fortunate to be able to work with them, just when I joined the Bureau, actually. And I still maintain contacts with them to this day after they retired. They're great people.
Well, before you took the leadership role that you have now, I know that you worked as a forensic examiner for 10 years and that you were the first non-agent to become a fully qualified explosive and hazardous device examiner for the FBI.
That is correct. It's a medium length story on how I got to that point, because when I began my career in explosives, I was a researcher. I was out in New Mexico at a small institute called New Mexico Tech, which had something called the Energetic Materials Research and Testing Center, a research division within the university. And when I got out there in the mid 90s, I started focusing on making explosives and studying terrorist explosives. So I literally made the same things the bad guys made, but studied them from a scientific point of view so that we could get a greater understanding of what truly their properties were, their hazards, how they could be weaponized. And if you do that long enough, the FBI kind of takes notice of you. And the FBI actually came out and did some research programs with me, the folks who investigated basically the 93 bombing of the World Trade Center, the 95 Oklahoma City bombing. They came out and I did testing with them. During the late 90s, there was a little bit of a kerfuffle within the laboratory and the explosives unit, the unit within the FBI that does this post-blast investigation, had some oversight, and they were told, you guys need to hire some scientists to kind of round out the agent cadre that you have. So instead of just hiring someone fresh out of grad school, they had already worked with me. I was a known entity. I did research and range testing, demolition testing on things they were interested in. So they came in and basically offered me the chance to apply for a position. I was fortunate enough to be selected. And that's where I spent my first 10 years as a forensic examiner who analyzed the bombs components, the bomb effects. Even though I'm a PhD chemist, I wasn't a bench chemist. I was the first non-agent that did the bomb aspect of our investigation.
Well, I knew it was going to happen already. I had mentioned a few cases that I had covered already, and then you just dropped two more, which which is the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. I've covered that, John Antasiv, in episode 261. And then you also mentioned the Oklahoma City bombing, which I've also covered. So, yeah, that's why this was such I don't want to use fun. You shouldn't use fun when you talk about, bombing and terrorists, but it was such a fascinating book to read, and I definitely recommend it. All right. So one of the things that you said in the book was that you called yourself a one-man traveling bomb show based on all your training and your experiences. So we get to have you put on that show for us today. So I thought the best way to do that would be to talk about some of the bombing crime scenes you have gone out to around the world and talk about those. And during your discussion, your presentation here, I hope we'll learn more overall and in general what it is exactly that a forensic bomb examiner does. So where do you want to start this show?
Wow, so much to choose from. I think I'm going to start in the 90s. And I think the best way to start would be with the two cases we just mentioned, World Trade Center and Oklahoma City. Even though I wasn't in the FBI at the time, my role in assisting the FBI was to study the science behind those bombings. The World Trade Center bombing was 1,200 pounds of an explosive called urea nitrate. Now, at that particular time, the FBI actually had reproduced that amount of material and were getting ready to test it. However, as you know, Jerry, sometimes in cases, the judges kind of put a halt in that kind of activity because the defense says it's going to be prejudicial. So they literally had to wrap up this 1,200 pounds of homemade explosive that they put together and store it for a while. Well, the trial kind of progresses, and then as it clears, they're given kind of the green light to work with this, and they came out to New Mexico with this material to detonate it. And I just happened to be just at the very early part of my career in the laboratory where I was making explosives. So I got to meet everyone. I got to see this material detonated in a Ryder van on the ranges of New Mexico. Actually, the hardest part of that test series was keeping people from trying to steal the wheels off that brand new Ryder van and replace it with some of the older ones on our trucks. But the science was pretty basic, because what we try to do in all these test series is we try to figure out how powerful the explosives are. And so the Ryder was set up with this 1,200 pounds of an explosive we've had very little experience with. It was detonated. There were vehicles placed around the charge to look at damage. There were pressure gauges to monitor the pressure in the air, because when an explosive detonates, it pressurizes the air, which is what causes the damage. And so there was a plane up in the sky that had an IR camera to look at the heat signature of the bomb. There were a good number of diagnostics put on this. And so to me, this was my first introduction into how the world of science, much more book learning, as you will at that point, because I was new into the explosives, really dovetailed into the world of investigation. It kind of hooked me a little bit there. And then next in line comes obviously Oklahoma City. And I describe in the book that I was actually with a bunch of the investigators at a seminar that we were running in New Mexico when that occurred. And watching all of those folks kind of move out of the room and get called to duty, again, really inspired me to want to be more involved in that. If not as a scientist, I never thought I could join the FBI, but at least I could do some research that would be beneficial. And I ended up then years later working with that same unit when they reproduced the World Trade Center to do the same diagnostics. So those two cases, even though I wasn't involved in the investigation, I was involved in the very tail end where we try to understand the science of what happened and the properties of the explosive. And that's how I launched my career with those two cases and the research that was being done by the FBI at that time on those two cases.
Well, let me ask you, is there a way for you to differentiate between what a forensic examiner would do and what a special agent bomb tech does?
Yeah, I can do that, because they're two different tracks. Within the FBI, we have the special agent bomb techs, such as Barry Black and Kevin Miles. The simplest way of looking at it is our bomb techs are trained all at the same schoolhouse, the FBI, state and locals, and they're trained to basically render a device safe. And that's a simple way of saying, hey, this thing looks dangerous now. The bomb techs are trained to go in, make sure all the components are put into an order that they can't detonate, that they're safe, to then get shipped back for analysis into the lab. So I was never a bomb tech. I'm not one of the people that are out there in a bomb suit in Hollywood fashion deciding whether I want to cut the blue or red wire or something of that nature. I'm a guy who waits until these courageous folks do their job, collect the evidence, and send it back to the lab. Then our forensic examiners basically look at the suite of evidence that's come back in, determine how the bomb was going to function, figure out what it could have done in terms of damage. And we have two different disciplines within the explosives unit that does this. We have the chemists who tell us, hey, this is what was in the bomb. And if we have bulk sample, it's easy. Or if there's a bomb that's gone off, they look at the trace analysis, the trace residue scattered throughout the environment. And they say, hey, based on this, we think this was in the bomb. And then folks like myself, that was 10 years, more than 10 years ago when I was an examiner, look at the bits, the pieces, we put them back together, we figure the functionality. The bomb techs in the field, while we're doing all this months and months of analysis, they're on to the next device. They're making the public safe by making the next device safe. And then basically we are on the tail end of the investigation, looking at the forensics and testifying into court on how this device was put together, how it functioned, and what it could have done.
Well, that was very helpful. Thank you. One of the things that I think that distinguishes the work that you do from what people typically think of is that, for the FBI anyway, is that you're not just looking at the evidence and the forensic aftermath of a bomb on the investigative side. You're also looking at it in situations where you might be asked to go to a foreign country where there were no American citizens involved. So could we talk a little bit about that?
Oh, certainly, certainly. And to explain why the FBI goes to foreign countries, there's a number of reasons. And you kind of led up to one of them. If there are American citizens involved, then obviously the United States government, we want to make sure that the investigation is as thorough as possible. We want to make sure that justice is done for our people. That is, the mission, strong mission of the FBI. However, the FBI, in terms of bombing investigations, we deal with all the major bombing investigations that you've heard of in history. So we have a wealth of experience within the FBI in terms of how to do forensic analysis of bombs of a wide range of complexity. And because of this, oftentimes foreign countries, which may never have seen bombs before, and a prime example is Casablanca, which we've mentioned kind of in passing. This is a country that wakes up one morning and has a series of bombs go off throughout one of its major cities. And they're not sure how best to approach this, how best to do the forensics. They have smart people, they have capabilities, but they just don't have the experience to put it all together. I don't want to denigrate, what these other countries do, but experience teaches you a lot of hard lessons, and the Bureau and the FBI has learned those hard lessons, and we can come in and we can advise. We can say, hey, we've experienced this before. We've seen this type of bomb. Why don't you collect this residue? I think this is associated with this. This is kind of how we would approach it. And we give some guidance to help them in their investigation, even if there are no American citizens involved. That's part and parcel of what we do. We're an asset for the world in many ways.
Well, I love the part in your book where you say, imagine trying to do the orderly function of a forensic scientist in a place where everyone's screaming at you in a foreign language. You have no idea if they're screaming at you, about you, or to you, and they don't always seem particularly happy that you're there. That's wild.
Yeah, that was one of my object lessons coming into the Bureau. And I'm sure in the early part of your career, when you came into the Bureau, you had all sorts of stereotypes and expectations of what you were going to encounter, which were shattered the minute you worked your first case and you started realizing what reality was going to bring to you. In the United States, we have control of the scene, and it's ours. So the perimeter's ours, the scene's ours, how we approach it is ours. When we are guests in another country, we have to play and abide by their rules and their desires. And sometimes we enter a scene because there's political pressure to have us there. Other times we enter the scene because the country honestly wants us there at the highest levels. But sometimes the local military and police are not as happy to see us because they might see us initially as a threat before they get to work with us and see that we are honestly there to help. And I've never had a situation where after working with these people who may have had some trepidation about us being there, at the end of our experience there, weren't glad and weren't happy to have us there and didn't develop a good relationship. But there's always that initial foray that it's a little tense. And the FBI, we're there to help. I know it's a horrible saying, we're from the government, we're here to help. But on occasion, there is a truth to that.
Yeah, I remember that, that saying. Because I've done episodes on many of the American cases, the cases that took place in the USA, I thought that we would concentrate our focus a little bit on those that occurred in foreign countries. I'd love to talk a little bit about just the tension involved when you went to Beirut in Lebanon.
Okay.
But I thought we would start first with the bombing in Bali, which was just unbelievable to even imagine, all of the carnage there. And again, not to talk about the carnage, but to talk about how you can get your arms around that in order to examine and do an analysis of the crime scene. And then also a crime scene that you went to in a South American country that shall not be named. Which one do you want to do first?
I think South America has the least amount of detail in it, and it's a good case to start with because it was my introduction and my eye-opener to just how foreign deployments really work when you're thrown into the fire.
All right, let's go.
And so the most important thing, and the reason I included the chapter about South America, and I'm just going to say that because there are certain sensitivities that the FBI doesn't want to broadcast every country that we're working in, and for various reasons. So just keep it to South America. It doesn't matter if it's Brazil, Argentina, whatever. It's all the same thing. So a bomb goes off, and when a bomb goes off in a country, if there is a reason to call in the FBI, we are called in. In this particular case, there was some political sensitivities, and they asked us to come in to kind of mediate and to look at things. And I was expecting when I got there what I would expect the United States, which is a pristine crime scene that's been preserved. And basically, we can come in, we can do our collection in an orderly fashion, we can then start doing analysis. And I got there, and the crime scene had been, shall we say, processed, cleaned, and rehabilitated to all intents and purposes. So there was really nothing for me to do in what I felt was the most integral part of my job initially, which was process a crime scene.
When you arrived, how long had it been since the bombing occurred?
I'm trying to remember. I think it was approximately 36 hours. So I can see why there would be some cleaning up, not to the extent that it was with, windows replaced and that kind of stuff. But there's often a delay, a temporal delay, obviously, between someone asking for help and then us clearing through the embassy, the FBI channel, State Department, getting transport. In that particular case, we flew a Bureau aircraft down there, so we didn't have to do commercial. We had that on our side time-wise.
But 36 hours later, having the crime scene cleaned seems pretty fast. Was this the one where all the cars were piled on a side street?
Yeah. One of the ways they cleaned the scene is they took all the cars that were damaged, to include the car that carried the bomb, and just put them in a King of the Hill type pile in an alley next to one of the police stations, which was another thing I was looking at saying, all right, it's difficult to get now to just the bomb vehicle because it's part of this massive devil's Jenga on the side of the police station. How do you get to different parts to look at it? My partner at the time was a senior agent, an agent who basically I mentioned in the book was a car guy. So he was trying to, I still have a picture of him. I was in the top of the police station taking pictures down on top of that pile, like I said, King of the Hill fashion, trying to get to the VIN number of the vehicle to help affect some identification. But yeah, all the vehicles were kind of put there. And one of the things I would do in a crime scene initially was I would look at the damage to what we call the delivery vehicle or the target vehicle, get an idea, all right, with this much damage, the charge size was probably in this neighborhood. Then I would look to see how much damage was done to neighboring vehicles. And again, to further bolster my estimate of charge size, this is the kind of thing that we do in the States. We very methodically go through. It's kind of difficult to do that when everything's in a big heap.
Now, I could imagine the expression on your face when you saw that.
Yeah, it was one of those moments where I'm like, I really didn't think I signed up for this. I was expecting something a little different. But I said that's why this particular case is actually put in the book, even though I didn't have a lot to do in the analysis and our investigation was minimal. It was an eye-opening experience to me that set the stage and my expectations, more importantly, to what I would be facing in future crime scenes.
All right. So why don't you take us to the next crime scene where things were a little bit better?
That's Bali. Bali was another interesting one. Whereas we had the 36 hours till we get to South America, I had 33 hours alone in transit on aircraft getting into Bali. And again, they've called the FBI. If you watch too many television shows, you think that we're on an FBI aircraft and we're zooming at 40,000 feet. No, we're on commercial aircraft, and the people who bought the ticket bought us a one-way ticket into Indonesia, which means it's going to flag every security system and every airport that you go through. My pal, who was an agent, got secondary searched everywhere. We get into France, and they're doing the questioning of both of us because we have this one-way ticket. They radio ahead to Bali, letting us know these two suspicious characters are coming in. And when we get into customs in Bali, we're greeted by someone we thought was one of our facilitators, who was actually a custom guy who was trying to get us to bribe him to let us into the country. At that particular junction in time, I lost some of my equanimity and basically informed the gentleman I'd be more than happy to get in the next flight and he could explain to his government why we're not in country. But I mean, this gives you an idea. Again, me looking at this as someone who's coming in now commercial for the first time, thinking I'm going to have the red carpet rolled out for me and I'm going to be able to come in and do what I need to do. It again helped set right my expectations. And we get out of the airport and there's no one to greet us. And we're calling into, and it's not an embassy, it's a consulate. We're calling into the consulate, trying to get in touch with someone on the ground. The FBI, Liga, and ALAT are trying to get in the country, so they're not there. And so we call ahead to one of the contract embassy people who says, well, just get in a cab and have them take you to the crater, which didn't seem like the best idea to me at the time.
No, it doesn't. I mean, here you are coming from a different country and you're just going to pull up in a taxi and say, hey, let me see your crime scene. Let me see your crater, which of course I can't wait till you get to the part about the crater, but go ahead.
So then we eventually make our way through various police stations to the crime scene to meet up with our Australian colleagues. And now we've been on the air and in transit for almost 40 hours. Another wonderful thing, just as we approach the crime scene, and we see the Australians on their side, we're about to call out to them. One of the locals who is guarding the perimeter with the stock of his rifle kind of pushes my partner backwards because he thinks he's getting too close. At which point, all these hours of transit and his dry sinuses take effect, and he gushes blood out of his nose like he's been hit. And the Australians rush over, recognizing us. They start yelling at this poor local kid who's guarding it with his rifle, and then that creates its own potential international incident. So eventually we clear that. Oh, sorry for that poor kid. Get to the crime scene and start dealing with trying to do a general analysis. The Australians had been there before us. And it's important to realize that we were called into this scene by two groups of people. One was the Indonesians, and the other was the Australians. The Indonesians, Bali is the most peaceful islands there is. They were horrified. It was like being struck by lightning for them to try to figure out how to move forward. The Australians came in because Bali is kind of like their version of our Bahamas. They got a lot of their citizens who go there as tourists. They go there for vacation. And they had lost a good number of citizens, had perished in this attack. In fact, they had lost the most citizens of any other country, any nation in that particular attack. So the Australians wanted us there as well because they weren't used to dealing with massive vehicle bombs. And at that point, remember, in the U.S., we had both the World Trade Center and we had Oklahoma City. We had worked with the Brits on their experience with their vehicle bombs, and we had a British contingency there as well. Some of our colleagues over from the UK who had dealt with the pirate vehicle bombs in London in the 90s. So they were just asking for our guidance in how to process a scene of this magnitude. So that's why we were there in the first place.
Well, I have to tell you that my husband and I are planning a trip to Bali, so I'm really listening to what you're saying today.
You probably have a little bit different experience than we did, I certainly hope. When we got there, basically, sadly, all the tourists had cleared the area, for obvious reasons. And so we were put up in a 4-star hotel that was totally just deserted. It was actually creepy coming in at night, going through all the outdoor hallways and this, that, and to their little hotel restaurant with absolutely no one around. It was a very odd experience. But the Balinese people are just beautiful people. They're very giving. They're very loving. They were wonderful. So I'm sure you'll have a great time with that. I'm not a big beach person, so I can't speak to the beaches. But other than that, the people are fabulous. So what ends up happening is we have 3 different devices that we know of that have gone off. One of which obviously is this massive vehicle bomb outside Sari's nightclub, this open air nightclub. Another was a smaller device that went off inside Patty's bar, which was about a block down the street within the bar itself. And then there was a device that went off on a street well away from this district, this tourist district, kind of between the American consulate and I think it's an Australian embassy. I don't remember if it's embassy or consulate there. Basically, our 2 facilities. And so obviously our focus was going to be on the vehicle itself and the bar and the device that went off inside the bar. And so right off the bat, when we think we're going to just start looking at craters and move on to do kind of an analysis, the American ALAT comes up to us and says, hey, the Australians think they found a bomb that the locals missed, or a bombing center that the locals missed. And so we ended up spending a day, as did the UK, working with these guys because there was one vehicle that was placed in an odd situation that was more damaged than anything else. And we had to figure out how this got where it was. And I write in detail in the book the mystery of that vehicle. But it took us a whole day just to parse through forensically why this vehicle was so badly damaged when the vehicles in front of it and behind it weren't, and why it wasn't the scene of an additional bombing that no one had uncovered. And that was basically done through just pure explosive analysis. Through my careers in New Mexico in the 90s, I'd blown apart or had witnessed vehicles, hundreds of them in the different shots that we did. So after a while, you start recognizing explosive damage and where the shock wave comes from and magnitudes. And so we were able to figure out that that vehicle was part of the larger vehicle bomb scene, and it just kind of got tossed in the air and magically landed in just the wrong spot to confuse everyone.
Oh, wow. It lifted it to the point where it still landed back on the wheels?
Explosive physics is an amazing thing. It doesn't really violate natural laws, but it comes close to the perimeter.
Wow. Yeah, that would have been very confusing for anyone.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And myself and my partner, we actually decided to look at the vehicle separately and to sit there, go around it, make notes. And then we came back and gave each other our assessment, which was identical. And then went and worked with the Australians and kind of led them through, hey, look at this, look at that. And then the lights started turning on. But again, it wasn't that they didn't have, technical capabilities. They just didn't have that particular experience. And then when you are faced with this overwhelming sea of debris and destruction, to try to take all that and make it white noise and focus on just this one aspect, it's challenging. And these guys had probably been, at that point, going on a couple days with very little sleep. So I could see how they would get kind of confused with this. And so that's part of our role, like I said, when we come into these things, is to give a fresh set of eyes.
Yeah, I made a note. I went through your whole book with my annotation in my Kindle with the making yellow marks over it. But on one of the chapters, probably this chapter, you said that you had seen the carnage of high explosives visited on hundreds of cars and had witnessed the interplay between shockwaves in air and a wide variety of barriers that unwittingly got in their way. And I guess in this particular case, nothing got in that car's way. And
No, it had a clear path for some reason. Like I said, the universe sometimes plays jokes on you. But when I talk about why I'm a bombing investigator or why I focus on the bombs themselves instead of chemistry, even though I spent 9 years of my life studying chemistry to get a PhD, it's because you can learn about chemistry in school, but there's very few schools that you actually can go out into the range and spend years blowing things apart and get that kind of on-the-job training, as it were, that experience. And that, coupled with my understanding of my foundational understanding, gave me different insight when I did forensic analysis. And it's been very valuable for me.
now I'm not going to go through the entire case review reading from your book, but there's one more thing that I have to bring up because we're all thinking of you going through this crime scene and looking at bomb components and doing a type of thorough analysis. But one of the things that you write about is that shifting through the destruction left by a bomb means sorting through human remains. So let's talk a little bit about that and
Yeah.
what routine you started to develop as you work these type of cases.
All right. I'll go back to early human remains. I won't give much detail in the cases, but I'll talk about how I was introduced into this. And the first one is going to be the USS Cole. And I had joined the Bureau about a year and a handful of months before the Cole was attacked.
I have to stop you for a second because that's yet another case I have done a case review on. So, yeah, your interview here is pulling all of this together. So,
I've been fortunate. I have worked a huge number of cases. Now, there's a character I mentioned in my book, not a character, but a real individual, Mark, who is a unit chief of the explosives unit. You ever get him on your show? He's retired now. He can tell you stories for hours, and he's one of the best storytellers I've ever run across. And he's been involved in bombings into the 80s and up through all these major cases. He was the lead examiner on the Cole. And so he brought me out as a trainee to help recover evidence from the Cole when it came back into Pascagoula Harbor. And that it's one of those moments, again, when the Cole was floated in the Blue Marlin, the carrier ship, to see a destroyer piggybacked on this monstrosity actually coming into port. It was awe-inspiring. It just took your breath away. And then we spent a few days on the Cole. And the reason I mentioned bodies on this is because at this time it had been at sea for a long period of time. The bombing had obviously been way before it got to it. And there was definite stench of human remains and the carnage on that vessel. It was exceedingly unpleasant. And that's the kind of thing that you don't think about when you're watching crime dramas and things like that. And I had never experienced that before, obviously, other than dead animals on the side of the road. It's very, very similar, except you mix that in with diesel fuel, burnt diesel, and other burnt electrical wire and all that other stuff. It is hellacious odor. The next time I'm in a morgue is a young man has committed suicide with an explosive device, and I ended up going into the morgue to try to ascertain where that explosive device was. And what happens is, obviously, explosives are not kind to flesh, but the air blast of an explosive dies off very quickly. So if you have a 1 pound charge and it's sitting on the desk in front of you, it's probably not going to tear you to pieces. If you're holding it in your hands, they're gone. And so when I went into the morgue, I was greeted by basically a headless corpse that had no hands, and basically the shoulders had been blown out. So I'm trying to then piece back together how he was physically placed. And what I eventually ended up ascertaining is he had to be hunched over the explosive charge because his head was gone, his hands were gone, and his shoulders were gone. So it had to be almost cradled in that area of his chest. Now, while I'm doing this, looking at this poor unfortunate suicide victim, trying to figure out the placement of the charge, on the morgue table next to this guy is a morgue attendant. I don't know why they do this. I don't know what they're doing. I'm pretty sure I saw a scalpel and they're peeling off the skin of the face of this person. I don't know what procedure was required to do that. The only thing I'm thinking is, I don't really want to be here. I don't really want to see this. I don't want this in my subconscious. I have to focus on the headless corpse here to try to figure out what I need to do, and then I want to get out of here. And then the morgue attendant says, hey, I got something to show you, which is an equally bad thing to have happen to you. Because when a morgue attendant says, hey, this is really cool or neat, they've seen the most gruesome things imaginable. And so he shows me what they recovered of the poor kid's head, which was his eyebrows, basically sitting on a table separately. So I've learned to kind of become, you're not immune to it, but kind of focus on the science and try to let everything else wash past me. It is not a pleasant part of the job.
You know, when I was reading the book and listening to you talk, it is just hard to imagine how something like this becomes every day to you. It has to, not because you are an insensitive, heartless person, but to be able to get the job done. And I know that later in the book, you remarked that there was one situation where it occurred to you that this was the first dead body that you had ever examined that still had its head attached. I mean, that was wild.
Yeah, I guess thinking back at that, I've read a couple people's reviews of my book out of curiosity, and they do mention some of the gruesome aspects having an effect on them. And I was looking back thinking, I wouldn't even think about that, just because, like you said, you don't become immune to it, but you compartmentalize it into the science of what you're doing. You try to remove the humanity from it. And it's something, if you don't do, it's going to bother you. You're going to lose a lot of sleep. And I think everyone in our field who deals with this kind of tragedy learns their own way of coping with it, quite frankly. When I talk to other people, I say, hey, at least in my job, this is gruesome, but I don't deal with something as horrific, crimes against children, because I wouldn't want any of that horrific stuff in my subconscious.
Yeah, you know, I can see that because I think I could do or be around a dead body and in this kind of condition and be able to compartmentalize it. But I don't think that I could compartmentalize a child that had been mutilated or abused. I just don't think so.
I don't think I could either. And I've had some friends who are bomb techs who work those violations, and just some of the peripheral things they say are just heartbreaking.
Yeah. Well, I do know that in talking about being able to compartmentalize and put something aside in order to get the job done, that physically you have been kind of blessed, because I understand that at some point during your career, you've lost a bit of your sense of smell.
Yeah, most people would bemoan the loss of the sense of smell, and it also takes some of your sense of taste away as well. I worked in chem labs for so many years that some of the solvents, I think, kind of just slowly numbed the olfactory nerves or something like that. And so I don't mind it so much on occasions when other people are like hit really hard by an odor. It's like, yeah, that's unpleasant, but it's not something that's knocking on my heels. So I've been fortunate that way. Take your blessings where you can.
Yeah, but I guess you miss that lemony smell that you might get from, a delicious dessert or something.
Yeah, on occasion you miss that.
Mm-hmm. But again, it's a blessing when it comes to rotting human remains in the heat of a tropical country.
Exactly.
Where do you want to go next?
Basically, yeah, we're in Bali. We had just kind of figured out the car, which now leaves us to trying to figure out the broader aspects. Now, in this particular case, one of the mysteries that we had was in Patty's bar, people trying to figure out where that bomb went off. Because what happens in any criminal case, and I'm sure you've seen this in your cases, is you have all sorts of different witness reports, And sometimes they're in contradiction to each other. And you're trying to figure out what the ground truth is. If it's just an event with no physical evidence left behind, it's a little more difficult to figure out which witness has more veracity. But in the case of Patty's Bar, we had people who said, hey, it was a suicide bomber. Another group said, no, there's a moped who came up and threw a bomb in the window. And we had physical evidence. We had damage to the bar that we could sit there and parse through. And so one day, again, my colleague and myself went into this place and decided to try to do an analysis. Now, here's another myth that I'm going to shatter, is everyone watching movies and TV shows thinks we have all those wonderful instruments with laser sights and things that go beep and boop and basically computers that pump out answers to us. Not the case here. This was basically in the early 2000s. We didn't have a lot of high-tech gear. In fact, at that particular point, I was traveling with a 100-foot tape measure. We were thinking we were rocking when we got our first digital camera with a 3.5-inch floppy that you could put in that could hold 10 images on it at, kilobytes. That was just the height of technology. So we had limited resources. In Bali, we had very, very little. And so literally, I got our local bomb techs to bring me a bunch of twine. And then we went out and got a whole bunch of sticks. Because if you're thinking about a shooting and a shooting reconstruction, all you're doing in shooting reconstruction is trying to figure out where the holes were versus where the shooter was. And you're running a laser down that to try to figure out trajectories. A bomb is very similar, except a bomb is kind of like a gun that goes out in 360 degrees. It sends fragmentation everywhere. And so if you can figure out where all the fragmentation strikes are in a zone, you can use string and sticks and other things to bring them back into an epicenter. And so we spent hours going through this whole bar, looking at frag strikes, looking at areas that were sheltered, running strings and sticks, and putting it back in. And we were able to figure out, and I call this caveman forensics, basically. We were able to figure out ostensibly where that bomb was placed in space and kind of get an idea for it not being on the floor, not being X, Y, and Z, but probably being on a person. And that was the most logical scenario that fit the physical evidence that we were able to examine. The sort of local police watching us were trying to figure out what we were doing because, again, they have the same stereotype of the FBI, and we're literally there running string and taping it and gluing things and coming to point in space, and they're trying to figure out how to reproduce this and how to do it. It took us a while to explain to them that this is probably not the most optimum technique, but you can do basic science with minimum resources.
And that brings us to, I don't want to sidetrack you if we're still talking about this, but that brings us to another aspect of your responsibilities, and that is actually training your counterparts from other countries.
That is true. And you got to realize that at my heart, at the core of who I am, is a teacher. And my father, Ron Yeager, was an English teacher. And I watched his dedication for years and years and years of teaching, and oftentimes teaching people that didn't want to be taught. And I always had an aptitude for it, a desire for it. And so when I came to the Bureau, I was a college professor. At the same time, I was a researcher in chemistry, and I'm still a professor, an adjunct professor at a couple of universities. Now, there's a difference between teaching a PhD graduate student and teaching a firefighter. When I was in New Mexico, one of the things that we did out there was develop a training program for first responders, teaching them what they needed to know if they were going to walk into a bombing scene or walk into an explosive lab. Hey, what are the signs? What are the signatures? What are the dangers? When is it time to call for help? How to protect a scene? And so I developed a class out there while I was in New Mexico called Incident Response for Terrorist Bombings, where we taught rudimentary explosives, we taught safety, we taught scene preservation. And we had lectures, but we had the advantage of a range. We went out and made explosives and blew things up to give an appreciation to our responders on how powerful explosives are, how damaging they are, how dangerous they are. I left New Mexico in 2000, and that course basically grew, blossomed from we were doing it once a month to now they've trained 600,000 students and they do multiple classes a week. When I came to the Bureau, they pulled me into their post-blast training class. And I started training people in how to do post-blast as the Bureau was teaching me the scientific aspects. And as I got more adept at the analysis, teaching that. At the same time, I spent years making explosives, studying explosives, understanding the kind of things that terrorists and bad guys can make. I developed a whole training course on just what we call improvised explosives. The types of explosives that someone can make with ingredients they can get from a hardware store, ordering online, and the properties of those. And we went across the whole country teaching and training that. And that developed this whole training curriculum. And I handed that over to a very talented scientist and a forensic examiner who took my place, who runs it to this day. We took that overseas. We take our post-blast training overseas. And again, a portion of it is we are so very fortunate in the United States, and people don't realize it. Just the wherewithal, the things we have at our disposal and our capabilities are astounding. Even when you consider other westernized countries that you would think have equal capabilities, we just have so much and so many people and so much knowledge that it is always viewed as a value when the FBI comes overseas and provides this training, just because of not only our experience, but the fact that we have such diverse capabilities, so many tools, toys, and the experience. So to this day, I'm still a teacher, and that's still one of the things that brings me the most pleasure in my job is being a teacher.
And another advantage of that, you talk about how relationships move the world.
Yeah. And I'll give you a prime example of how a relationship starts and how at the very end, years and years later, it becomes something that is a benefit to everyone, and that is Beirut. The Syrians obviously had a very strong foothold in Beirut, and many, many years ago, they kind of withdrew. And when that happened, there became a spate of assassination in Lebanon of basically people who were anti-Syrian. Even though the Syrians were gone, people who were voicing strong anti-Syrian started having bombs placed under their vehicles. And so I was fortunate enough to be on the first team that made entry into Beirut after the Syrians kind of pulled out after one of these bombings. And that there's a chapter in the book on that. And I'm not going to go into too much detail at the moment, but the important thing is the relationship. Because what happened there is we did the investigation, we met with all the state and locals, and then what happened is we met up with their bosses, so the colonels, the generals, the diplomats, and we had a long discussion with them about, hey, what do we need to get ourselves up and running so we can do this kind of investigation on our own? And so we came up with a list of courses that would be valuable, because the FBI teaches evidence response as well. We have wonderful people who focus on nothing but recovery of evidence, our evidence response teams in the field, and the unit within our headquarters that guides them, that gives them the training and wherewithal and tools. And so we laid out, hey, you need post-blast investigation, you need evidence response, you need this training. And we brought many, many teams over from Lebanon into the U.S. to train them over a course of a number of years. Now, you can come forward now to the point where there's a detonation of a warehouse filled with ammonium nitrate in Beirut. And what happens is they call our team in. And at that point, we had an examiner who had handed off all this stuff to and had developed very, very strong relationships with all these teams twice a year doing training with them. The FBI was trusted. We had worked with them. We had been an honest broker. They called us in for help. And truly, any country is going to need help when that massive explosive goes off. It is devastating. And trying to figure out what happened is very challenging. So what started off was a simple incursion in there to examine one bombing case, one isolated case that went into another case that led into training, led into this strong partnership and relationship, led us into an analysis of one of the worst explosive disasters, accidental explosive disasters in history.
I don't want to take away from you talking about the strong relationship by adding something somewhat comical. But you do have to talk about, because I mentioned this missing crater, that didn't occur in the country that I was thinking it did. That happened when you first went to Beirut.
Yes. And you don't see what's going on. When you're being deployed, what happens is you're minding your own business. You come in, you're getting ready to make yourself a cup of coffee or tea. I'm a tea drinker. And all of a sudden the boss comes in and says, hey, go home and pack. You're going to, the last place I went was Ethiopia. You got to leave on a plane this evening. And so you're frantically going out and trying to get yourself organized, packed, and prepared to go to this country. Well, that happened in Beirut. We actually deployed very quickly. That's one of the quickest turnarounds from event to being on the actual crime scene that we've had. It was, I think, it's just more than 24 hours. It may have been up to 36. I can't recall. But it was the fastest. I remember it was the fastest. And so I didn't see all the pictures from this scene. And when I came back and saw the pictures, it looked like a mob scene on this vehicle. Everyone and their brother was surrounding it, all the police, the military, the public. And so when I get there, I'm looking at a vehicle that has had a bomb placed underneath it. And it's pretty obvious because you look at which way the metal's going. If the metal's going into the car, then the bomb was on the outside. And so that's not really high physics. But then I'm trying to figure out what in God's name happened to the crater. And it's just mystifying me. And I got blinders on at this point. I'm tired. I've been on a plane this whole time. Again, I'm US centric. I'm thinking, this is a crime scene in the US. No one would have touched this. I'm thinking like I was in my own country. The legal comes up to me, our legal attaché, and says, hey, you mean that over there, which was about 20 feet away, a big divot in the ground where the vehicle was before someone moved it for whatever reason they moved it. So again, it's the nature of the beast. We would never have moved it like they did there. And that was one of the things that we talked about, is preserving crime scenes and that kind of stuff. But it's sometimes kind of hard to lose your US centric view of things.
Definitely keeps you on your toes.
Yeah. It's funny, if you look at this book, a lot of people, when they write or think about an FBI book, think about what I call the hero's tale, where this person or people come in and they do this wonderful thing. They dive in, they solve the case, and hoopla at the end. This is a bunch of snippets that are designed to teach some history, some science, and give a true understanding of the humanity behind how all this works. So none of these things stand on their own. They're a body that gives the broader picture that I wish to give. Because I'm a small portion of it. Even in the US, I'm a scientist. I bring science to the table. We have agents in the field doing fabulous investigation. We have intel analysts who are giving a broader picture of the threat sphere. We have every kind of magical support that you can imagine out there, from aviation to evidence response. So this book to me is not so much about me as how I learned what the Bureau truly is, and giving a look at the little science and truly the love for the people who do these amazing jobs.
That being said, let's go to Bangladesh, because when you got to Bangladesh, you definitely learned that other countries handle their not just forensic crime scene analysis and collection differently, but investigations differently. And you were placed in an uncomfortable situation where you were kind of shocked at some of the quote unquote techniques they used to gather information from subjects.
Yeah, that was, again, another one of those eye openers. And to put it into a perspective, the backdrop there was we'd already dealt with the debate in our country about what they termed enhanced interrogation. And it's an academic argument to people who basically are looking at it in the abstract. To me, when I was put face to face with the application of what ostensibly is torture, I know I'm not going to sugarcoat it, and given a tour of a facility where people are put to all sorts of heinous acts, it brings home the reality of it. And to me, it gave me more appreciation for what the United States represents as a country. And this is my personal opinion. I'm not representing anyone in this. In terms of rising above that and not allowing us to sink to that level, because I saw the dehumanization of someone actually brought in with a hood over their head, and the book covers some of the details. Luckily, I didn't see any of the physical action taking place. I saw the tools of the trade and was shown the tools of the trade. And that regime in that country has long since changed. And if you look at their own advertising or their own PR at that particular time, their own statements were criminals have no rights. So, the people who were in charge at that point were not subtle about what they were doing, and they were not hiding it. So being exposed to it as an American and with my background and being a scientist, again, not dealing with interrogations as much, was an eye-opener and made an impression, which is why I wanted to include that chapter. It's not so much about the investigation as another thing that I learned, another thing that shaped my view of what we are as the FBI.
Exactly. And we should stress that you just, again, saw the room and some of the tools and actually got to meet someone, one of the subjects, but the FBI did not participate in any way in those interrogations.
Absolutely not. We had nothing to do with that. In fact, the legal attaché mentioned that he spent a great deal of his time working with the police, trying to show them alternate techniques, trying to pressure them into using what the FBI would use in our interviews. well, as we do, we're basically a guest in the country. We're trying to guide countries that do things like this.
All right. So we've been talking for a while, and the title of your book is The Bomb Doctor, a scientist's story of bombers, beakers, and bloodhounds. Now, I think we've covered the bombers and the beakers, but what you got to tell people, of course I know because I read the book, but you got to tell people what bloodhounds have to do with being a bomb doctor.
And that's an excellent question. I never would have thought I would fall into that world. And was because of a colleague of mine who's passed a number of years back, who ran across some bloodhound groups in California who were doing amazing things. And as a scientist, I'm not just drawn to explosives. I'm fascinated by all science. And this was truly fascinating because I didn't realize the discriminating ability of a bloodhound in terms of being able to track a single individual. And this group in California, because there was a lot of drive-by shootings at that time, had worked and figured out how to train bloodhounds to track scent from a single expended cartridge. Like in a drive-by shooting, if a single bullet cartridge comes out the window, if they collect that, they learned how to track scent from that. And in a drive-by shooting, as the name implies, the shooter is in a car. And so they were able to track cars, not just from a single bullet, but the person fleeing in a vehicle. And the science behind that was just so fascinating. And so the examiner who got involved with this group was an explosive examiner like myself. And he thought that there would probably be utility if they could track off a single casing, probably they could track off a piece of a pipe bomb. And so we started doing research because one of the more common bombs in the United States is a pipe bomb. We started researching, seeing whether these same teams who were trained up to this level, and let me be clear, it's not every bloodhound that can do this. These were the elite of the elite that had figured out how to do this. They really were dogmatic in their training. They did some innovative things, and we figured they could trail from a pipe bomb. And so we started doing research and found out, even after a bomb detonates, there was still enough scent for them to be able to trail. And we'd done research before that showing after a bomb detonates that fingerprints and DNA can still survive on various components. So it shouldn't be too shocking that the scent of a person who has handled this thing also has a chance of surviving. And so that led us into a series of research programs with them. But to research them, we had to kind of deploy with them to understand what they were doing. And so we went out on a variety of calls with them. And the book covers me going out on calls from serial killers, tracing serial killers, all the way up to the DC snipers, trailing the DC snipers based on, again, items that they had left behind, because they left behind notes, don't forget, as well. So that was probably one of the more tense points in my career because I was doing my day job as an explosive examiner and training at nights going out with the bloodhounds and trailing after people, especially right after shootings occurred. We went after the one shooting. One of the victims that died was an intel analyst for our organization, the FBI, and we ran out after that trying to trail him. But I'm assuming you've been in DC and you know just how much fun it is trying to get around during rush hour and in traffic and trying to get from place to place quickly. And especially during that time period, they were shutting down roads entirely when they were trying to chase after the white panel van everyone was seeing at every site. So it was very challenges for the track, but it was a different tool that could have had application in our field. And then I ended up all these crazy call outs with this group as we were trying to figure out how we could apply the tool to our particular application. So it was one of the more fascinating things I've ever been involved with in terms of what these canines were capable of doing and not understanding their limitations or trying to figure out their limitations, because scent is easier to contaminate things with than it seems in just about anything else. And so if you have multiple people in the same car, all the people's scent is in that car, and you can trail one of those people, but you've got to make sure you're not trailing the other people in the car. And that means you need items of their scent to blank the bloodhound off on. And it just goes on and on and on. So I help basically develop protocols and techniques for application of this technique as a scientist, whereas my partner, who is an agent and one of the bombing investigators, looked more at the investigative aspect of the tools. I helped them design research programs and design how we could apply this. It was exceedingly challenging, to be honest with you, and trying to find application for it. We were never able to because it would be so much money in that research. in so many years. We found ways of applying it, and we still have the program within the Bureau where we train with other groups that have these bloodhounds, but we don't have any of our own.
Well, I know I usually don't like to set up teases, but there is a point in the book where you talk about, the one that got away, but I'm not going to ask you to talk about that here. They're just going to have to read the book.
I have to read the book for that one. Yep.
I had to remind everyone that you are currently the FBI's chief explosive scientist. So you decide to write this book with your sister, Celine Yeager. So I have to ask you, why didn't you do what everybody else does, and that is to retire and then write your book? Why did you decide to do that book now, which of course, I mean, you can discuss it if you want to, you don't have to, which adds some limitations to what you can get from the book. Why did you need to do that book now and not wait till later?
And that's an excellent question. I've been asked that multiple times. When I was first approached, my sister is a professional writer and she has many books. And so she has circulated in this field for many years. She has an agent, she knows editors. And so there was a story on me in Popular Mechanics that one of her agents read. And this was a Bureau sanctioned story. And the agent said, "Hey, your brother ever think about writing a book?" And I kind of took it loosely and said, I've thought about it. It might be something I can do. But the agent said, "Hey, I'm really interested." And I knew that I had a sister who knew this industry. And so I gave it some thought. I went to the FBI and asked them, "Hey, can I do this?" And there were many conversations. I won't even go into that occurred on that. But what it comes down to at the end of the day was I was given the options that you laid. Hey, you can retire and you can write this. You can quit and you can write this. If you write this as an employee of the FBI, you can get no remuneration. So I get nothing for this. And it's a decision. So I decided that in my experience, someday never comes. And I explained that. It's like I could wait. But at the moment, I have an opportunity. I have an agent that's interested. I have a sister who is in the industry who knows how to swim these waters. And more importantly, both my parents are still alive. And this is a chance to have a project with both their kids working together that they can enjoy, that we can share. And quite frankly, it's an ethical thing. I felt I didn't want to get paid for this because I have been so very fortunate in my career. The things I've been able to do, the community I've been able to serve, I just really wasn't interested in the remuneration. I wanted to get these stories out there. I wanted to have a chance to work with my sister, to have my parents experience this. And I don't regret a single one of those decisions, other than it's taken 7 years through the literary world to get this. And you know how much fun it is working in those waters to get this book out there. It was an experience to me. I gave an interview and said, you know what? Whether you're dealing with publishing or you're dealing with explosives, both of those industries have a lot of landmines, and I'm not sure which has the most.
I like that. Well, another thing that you've been able to do, which is a little different than what most active employees get to do, is that you have been a technical advisor for Mythbusters. And so for those people who don't know what Mythbusters is, why don't you explain that and then the work that you've been able to do with the show?
Yeah, Mythbusters is no longer on television. It used to be on television. It was an episodic series that looked at various urban legends and myths, and a lot of myths focus on explosives. And one of the myths is that an explosive can actually knock someone out of their shoes and socks. So there's all these crazy myths. So what the Mythbusters would do, would they look at, quote unquote, an urban legend or a myth, and they would try to see if there was a kernel of truth in it. And if there was, they would say, hey, this is confirmed. If it wasn't, they'd then take it to the next level and say, all right, if we can't do it the way the myth says we can do it, let's see if we can force factor this in. And with explosive, it was always, if we can't do this with this much explosive, we're just going to use more and see if more will work. And so in the Knock Your Socks Off episode, basically, they were trying to figure out how much explosives to use to literally knock someone out of shoes and socks. And so they started off with regular gym socks, then they went to, looser fitting socks, and then went to bigger and bigger explosive charges. But the one key here was, all right, you can knock someone out of their socks, but they can't be killed during this event. So they put pressure gauges on the dummy to make sure it wasn't exposed to such pressures that would actually kill a person. And so at that particular time, one of their assistants in their show was one of the old retired FBI bomb techs, Frank Toyle, who's passed since. And I knew Frank from years back, so he would call me on occasion saying, hey, they want to do this crazy thing. Can you do some calculations for me? And by about the fourth or fifth show, he did this like, Frank, you have now called me on this one show about 5 times. They keep changing the charge size. Here is my one ask. I'm not getting paid for any of this. That's fine. I want credits as a technical advisor on this show. And the only reason I asked for that was at time, my boys were both fairly young. I think they were preteen. And I watched the show with them every week. It was one of our bonding things. And I wanted the gravitas of showing them my name on screen as a technical advisor for this show because it would give them much more pride than my job in the FBI.
Well, talking about myths, as you may know, that I wrote a book called FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives. And we covered 2 of the things in that book that are misconceptions that you actually talked about in your book also. One of them is, what a crime scene collection looks like and the CSI effect. And the other one is that being a bomb tech is a very dangerous job. And, where they show the bomb techs cutting the red wire and the green wires and the sweat running down their forehead. So I wanted to ask you what you thought were some of the biggest myths that people have about bombs and explosives and, people like you who work in that world.
Yeah, that's easy enough. I can give you a couple off the top of my head. And the first is, quite frankly, the visual appeal that Hollywood interjects into their explosives. Because when you're on the big screen, you want something that looks dynamic. That's the appeal. Explosives are not that exciting to watch in real life. In fact, what Hollywood does is they add gasoline, diesel, paraffin, a whole host of things into their explosive that will slowly burn in air and create a fireball. In fact, in the FBI, when we do demonstrations, we do a shot that mimics that just to show people the Hollywood effect. And then for the rest of the demo, they can see the less appealing visual effects of explosives. So kind of the visualization of bombs and bombings is way overblown. Another effect sometimes is the misrepresentation of the power of explosives. I think it's a Die Hard, if I remember right, has a scene with the red fluid that mixes. They have a little bit on a paperclip and they throw the paperclip and it launches a chair in the police station. Explosives are not that powerful. They're dangerous in quantities of the grams to the ounces. Yeah, they can take off a hand, but they're not going to do that much particular work. So those are 2 things that come to the forefront right away, to be honest with you. And another thing is the complexity of bombs. I'll come back to Die Hard. If I remember, I can't remember which one it is. It has that huge contraption that's mixing liquids together with all sorts of beeping lights and blinking type of things. Most bombs are fairly simple. You're not going to see that kind of complex electronics behind it. So these things are done to add drama because that's what Hollywood wants. We don't need that kind of drama in my life, quite frankly.
Definitely not. And what about the CSI effect? Could you explain what that is and tell us maybe if you had some examples where it has actually, affected your work and what the FBI does?
Yeah, I can do that. And the CSI effect, the simplest way of looking at it is the development of unrealistic expectations based on overviewing of dramatized television shows. And CSI is a very popular series. And every week you have someone who comes up with some sort of amazing forensic solution to a complex case and they break the case wide open. That's not how life works. And I'll give you an example from the collar bomb. In the collar bomb, we had a collar and a bomb assembled together that was put together with screws and bolts and other things like that. And so when you have a device like that, you look for tool marks. And tool marks can actually be an amazing thing. In Oklahoma City, we actually had a quarry that had a bunker that was drilled into, and we matched the drill block with a drill bit from a search. However, you come to the collar bomb case, we had one suspect who I think stole every tool that he ever could get his hands on from every job he ever worked. Because when we did a search of the garage with potential tools, I ended up taking, I think, 120 odd screwdrivers and 638 or something like that drill bits that then our tool marks examiner had to compare to all the different tool or all the different components that were used to put together the bomb. So I was almost afraid to go down to his lab to deliver this package because this is months and months of his life that are going to go into looking at these tools, trying to figure out if we can do a relationship. And so in the CSI effect, people expect forensics to ride in like a white horse and solve everything. And sometimes you get lucky and you get good breaks. I've worked a lot of bombing cases, and I can't think of a lot of them that had fingerprints or DNA associated with them. Every now and then you get a lucky break and you do get it. But people have come to expect, hey, someone is going to get a forensic clue that's going to really break this for us. And like an investigation, you have investigative clues, you have forensic clues. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you strike out in both those realms. But people have come from watching too much TV to really expect that dramatic, wonderful bit of science to spice up the testimony in the case.
Wow. So it can hurt. I mean, I think I've heard of situations where there was an acquittal because the jury expected something that was not a part of the prosecution, and therefore they didn't feel that there was enough evidence, and I'm using quotes, air quotes, to convict.
Yeah, it's the development of unrealistic expectations because you've seen it so many times on television. Surely there has to be some truth in that. And it's not. The real world is not as cut and dry, sadly.
Well, Kirk, we have talked, for a long time, and I have been just fascinated by everything because, again, it ties back in to so many of the case reviews that I've done and the agents that I've spoken to. And so I've really, really enjoyed our conversation here. Is there anything that I didn't ask you or we didn't talk about that you'd like to mention before we move on to the last part of this episode?
I don't think so. I know part of the mission of this show is to highlight the FBI and the good things that the FBI does. And, for me, the thing I want to stress is I'm not the hero in this tale. I'm part of a broader story. And I've only been able to do what I've been able to do because of just the outstanding people in a wide variety of roles within the FBI. I count myself exceedingly fortunate to have had the experiences I've had to be able to contribute to the community I've been able to contribute to. And I appreciate the work that you're doing in your show to highlight things like this. It means a great deal to me.
Well, thank you so much. And so I just one more time want to mention your book, The Bomb Doctor, a scientist's story of bombers, beakers, and bloodhounds. But before we end the episode, and we did talk about this a little bit, but I always ask my standard question, when and why you joined the FBI. Now, I know they came looking for you.
Yes, they did. And I joined the FBI in June of 2000. So I've been in the FBI for slightly over 24 years. The why comes back to the inspiration I mentioned about Oklahoma City and the Trade Center and the interface I had with true FBI scientists who were examining both of those. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, regardless what I did, I know I wanted to do something of value to help people that made a difference. And I was going to be a scientist and a teacher because I love that. I love reaching out. Teaching makes a difference. My father spent his life doing that, and he made a huge difference in my hometown. I wanted to do that. The FBI gave me a platform to make a difference beyond anything I could have ever dreamed of.
Well, normally this is where I would say, well, when did you retire and what are you doing now? But but you're still active. So we'll move on to the very, very last thing that I ask, and that is your last words of wisdom. What would you like to say?
I would like to tell the listeners that the FBI is not coming in on a white horse and solving everything on their own. We work with state, we work with local, we work with the public. Everyone is part of the solution. There's a reason that we have the campaign, See Something, Say Something. Everyone has to be involved, especially if we're going to try to stop bombing plots and other things like that. Engage yourself, be part of the solution, work with us because we want to be a team.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of Dr. Kirk Yeager and links to articles about the FBI Laboratories Explosive Unit and bomb texts. Kirk also shared several images of his work with the FBI. In the show notes, you'll also find a link to where you can purchase his book, The Bomb Doctor, a scientist's story of bombers, beakers, and bloodhounds. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.